Welcome to Geopolitics with Ramin. Lately, things have been heating up between Russia and the West. Therefore, I thought I would like to burst the bubble of Ukraine's alleged democratic values. How democratic is Ukraine? How does Ukrainian nationalism pose a threat to Russia? The author Grzegorz Rozelinsky-Lieb described in his book Stepan Bandera, The Life and Afterlife of a Ukrainian Nationalist, Fascism and Genocide and Cult, the demographics and political climate of the territory known as Ukraine today. Stepan Bandera was born 1st of January 1909 in the village Staryi Uhriniv, located in the eastern part of Galicia and Lodomeria. The area of Galicia was created in 1772 by bureaucrats of the Habsburg Empire, known as the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria. During the first partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Galicia was economically backward, with a heterogeneous population of 47% Poles, 42% Ukrainians, and 11% Jews, according to statistics from 1910. Eastern Galicia, the home of the Ukrainian national movement, and where the cult of Stepan Bandera was born, was no less heterogeneous. 62% of the population were Ukrainian, 25% Polish, and 12% Jewish. At the time of Bandera's birth, 20% of all Ukrainians lived in the Habsburg Empire, that is to say, in Galicia, Transcarpathia, and Bukovina. The other 80% resided in eastern parts of Ukraine, which belonged to the Russian Empire. This division along political, cultural, and religious differences caused Galician Ukrainians to become a quite different people from the Ukrainians residing in the Russian Empire. This division caused difficulties for both socialist, moderate, and nationalist leaders and movements among the Ukrainians, such as Mikhailo Drahmanov, Mikhailo Khrushchevsky, and Ivan Franko, and later for the extreme, violent, revolutionary 20th century nationalists such as Dmitry Dontsov, Ivan Konovalets, and Stepan Bandera to create a single Ukrainian nation under one Ukrainian state. Let's talk about the differences between Western and Eastern Ukraine. Western Ukraine is more impacted by Polish culture. Majority of Western Ukrainians are Greek Catholic, and their elites were historically Polified, which rendered Ukrainians as a class of peasants. This created great animosity with the Polish authorities and the Polish feudal class. Eastern Ukrainians were assimilated to the Russian Empire and are by majority Orthodox Christian. Therefore, the concept of Ukrainian nationalism was quite foreign to them. The animosity towards Poles by Ukrainian nationalists was because they viewed the Poles as occupiers of their land and, with their cultural influence, denied them a nobility and intelligentsia. The hostility towards Jews came from the viewpoint that many Jews were merchants and some of them worked as agents for Poles, but also the Russians in eastern Ukraine. Hostility towards Russians were based on the belief by the Ukrainian nationalists that the Russian Empire occupied land that belonged to the Ukrainian nation. The reason why Ukrainian nationalism didn't take root in the eastern parts of Ukraine was because the Russian Empire was suppressing the Ukrainian nationalist movement. While in the Habsburg Empire, they had more liberal laws, which allowed it to grow. One of the most famous crimes carried out by the OUNB and parts of the Ukrainian Insurgency Army, UPA, was the Volyn massacre. It is estimated that 60,000 Poles were ethnically cleansed across eastern Galicia, and the number adds up to 100,000. Ukrainian nationalists also aided the German forces in massacring up to 34,000 Jews in Kiev, the so-called Babi Yar massacre, in 1941. The killings were sparked after two major explosions caused by mines left by the retreating Soviets. The Jewish inhabitants of Kiev were blamed for the explosions. The massacres were carried out at a ravine called Babi Yar, in the outskirts of Kiev. The OUN and UPA continued its insurgency against the Soviet Union up until the late 1950s with the help of the United States Marshall Fund, which funded the OUN UPA war against the Soviets with $100 million a year by 1951. Let's examine why Ukrainian nationalism is such a threat and problem for Russia, and how this political minority have infiltrated the political life of Ukraine. Western governments, political scientists, and politicians often claim that the Nazi problem in Ukraine is exaggerated by Russia. The first claim they make is that because Ukraine's current president is of Jewish descent, and the second claim they make it is if that the far right parties in Ukraine, well, that they only received around 2% in the elections, especially the Svoboda party. Right sector didn't perform much better either. None of these things are relevant. First of all, there were Jews working with National Socialist Germany and Fascist Italy. One of the most famous ones is Trotsky, for example. You can also read more about Zionist collaboration with the Third Reich and Fascist Italy in the book 51 Documents Zionist Collaboration with the Nazis, edited by Lenny Brenner. Therefore, using President Zelensky's Jewish background as an argument to claim that the Ukrainian state has not been infiltrated by far right and Nazi elements is ridiculous. In fact, Zelensky won the presidential election because he had promised to strike a peace deal with the Russian speaking Donbass region, as well as fighting corruption. However, in 2019, when he traveled to the front lines in Zolote and ordered the Azov battalion to stop the shelling, the commander of the unit, Andrei Belitsky, threatened Zelensky that he will send more soldiers to Zolote. Singer Sofia Fedina, a lawmaker for the European Solidarity Party of former President Petro Poroshenko, wished that he was killed by Russian separatist shelling of the city. This shows how much this political minority has power in Ukraine, so much so that they can form policy. When these Ukrainian nationalist elements have infiltrated the security apparatus, such as the police, intelligence services, and even have brigades and battalions with this ideology incorporated into the military of the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as the political life of the country, this gives them a lot of power. Them being a minority is therefore irrelevant because they are already influencing the country politically. You don't have to be in majority to have major political power in a country. In fact, in most countries, it is a minority elite that influences the cultural and political life. The leader of the neo-Nazi group C14 even said that the ultra-nationalist elements in the Maidan protests were probably less than 8 to 10%. But because the far right was the most effective and violent group among the protesters, they succeeded in overthrowing the democratically elected Yanukovych government. According to the leader's own words, if it wasn't for us, the protests would have ended up as a gay pride parade. Ukraine is the only country in the world that has incorporated ideologically neo-Nazi battalions, units, and regiments into their military. The most famous one is the Azov battalion, where the initial members, who were Russian-speaking from Kharkiv, came from the soccer hooligan crew Sect 82. Sect 82 were fanatic Metalist Kharkiv fans with ties before the war to the Spartak Moscow's ultra-nationalist football hooligans in Russia. During February 2014, in Kharkiv, when pro-Russian activism was very prevalent in the city, these ultranationalists sided with Ukrainians and occupied regional administrative buildings in the city. The unit was led by Andrei Belitsky, a well-known neo-Nazi who reportedly said that his goal is to lead the white races against the Semite-led Untermenschen. The Azov Brigade was partially financed by the oligarchs Sergei Taruta and Ihor Kolomoisky, who is partially Jewish. The Azov regiment, since it is part of the UAF, uses the black sun and wolf's angle as symbols on its patch. These two symbols were used by the Waffen-SS back in World War II. Other battalions and brigades with similar ideology exist in Ukraine, such as the Right Sector, or Pravý sector. It mainly recruited members from the right sector movement that was formed in the midst of the Maidan protests in December 2013. And it is led by Dmitry Yarosh. Yarosh announced in July 2014 that he will form a military unit of the right sector. And initially, he refused to legalize the structure and make it accountable to the Ukraine's defense minister. Eventually, though, Yarosh drafted a bill which defines Pravý sector as a voluntary military unit which combines, quote, responsibility before the state and before public initiatives from the side of Ukrainian citizens who wish to improve their military patriotic capabilities and to aid the armed forces of Ukraine and other military formations fighting for Ukraine, to defend Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, to provide state security, and to defend the state borders of Ukraine. End quote. Yarosh is currently a parliamentary member. Battalions such as the OUN, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, IDAR, Tornado, etc., are known for committing torture, looting, extrajudicial killings, rape, etc. Western media, military analysts, and politicians can do their best to act dumb, deaf, and blind when it comes to Ukraine's Nazi problem. The fact these nationalist groups have summer camps for children where they get indoctrinated into white supremacist Nazi ideology isn't something these liberal democracies want to talk about. And the purpose of these camps are to foster a new generation of ideological soldiers and to sever the historical links between the two Slavic brother nations. But if we analyze history, the support for extremists is nothing new. Western liberal democracies, so-called democracies, have always supported the most fundamentalist extremist groups and individuals in the respective countries that they seek regime change in. For example, in Afghanistan, they supported the Islamist Mujahideen to fight off the communist government in Afghanistan. In Latin America, they supported also fascist elements. And in countries like Indonesia, they supported Islamist insurgencies and so forth. In the case of Ukraine, they will support the Nazis. And for example, in Africa, if we look at Ethiopia, they supported the ethno-nationalist TPLF, who I would argue is a similar organization to that of the Azov Battalion, in my opinion. Now, some people will disagree with me, but they base their ideology on Tigray ethno-nationalism. But we can see a track record here that the West often supports extremists in order to get the job done. Another important topic that we have to talk about is corruption and repression of opposition people and so forth in Ukraine. So Ukraine is often depicted as a democracy struggling against attempted Russian authoritarian rule, a struggle between the civilized West and the barbaric Asiatic Russia. The struggle that Ukraine carries out is an extension to a struggle for freedom and values that the Western world upholds. This is obviously laughable, and if one digs deeper into Ukrainian politics, you can see that this facade quickly crumbles. In its attempt to purify and become the ethno-state that the Ukrainian followers of Stepan Bandera want, one of the first things that the Kiev coup regime did was to ban Russian literature and language culture. The Kiev City Council issued the ban to protect the Ukrainian language, according to them. Certain Russian cultural products were banned since 2012. Despite that, people in Ukraine speak both languages, and that both Russian and Ukrainian is used on television. The Ukrainian parliament drafted a new bill in 2019 to limit the Russian language in media and in the job market. The law demands that civil servants, military, doctors, and teachers only speak Ukrainian. This bill was championed by outgoing President Petro Poroshenko. Zelensky claimed that he would examine the bill to see if it violates the Ukrainian constitution. But in April 2023, he signed a new law prohibiting the use of Russian for street names, despite the fact that he himself is a Russian speaker. The Russian language isn't the only language that the new regime in Kiev either tried to ban or limit, but also Greek and Hungarian. In March 2022, President Zelensky's government decided to ban 11 opposition parties that were perceived as pro Russian. Not all of these parties have any direct links to the Kremlin and only project Russian soft power. Some of them are actually under sanctions by the Kremlin. Most of these parties have independent sources of income and interests. They also have a large electoral base. For example, three of the suspended parties who participated in the 2019 parliament elections received 2.7 million votes, that is to say, 18.3%. And in recent polls conducted before the Russian special military operation, these parties collectively received between 16 to 20% of the votes. Many left-wing parties were banned as well, such as many different communist parties, already back in 2015 as part of the decommunist agenda. This move was criticized by the Venice Commission. Corruption is also a huge problem in Ukraine, and is also one of the reasons why weapons don't reach the front lines, besides the Russian army destroying this equipment, obviously. So much so that many speculate that the United States and Ukraine's European allies might abandon them. Although there have been false promises by certain people that Ukraine can become a member of the European Union, others are far more honest about that project. Former European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker slammed Ukraine's EU membership possibility due to massive problems with corruption. The Ukrainian government has tried to crack down on corruption to satisfy the demands, or rather, polish an image for international support. The oligarch who sponsored President Zelensky to power, as well as his acting career, Ihor Kolomoisky, was arrested for allegations of fraud in September 2023. Weapons not reaching the front line and sold on the black market is not just a problem for the Ukrainian armed forces, but can pose an issue for everybody if it ends up in the wrong hands. Many of these weapons end up in Africa, but they've also been confiscated by the police in Finland when raiding motorcycle gangs. These weapons have also been found in Sweden and the Netherlands. Sweden, a country where I reside, already have major problems with gun violence. Majority of the guns that are used by criminal networks and gangs come from the former Yugoslavia. The war in Ukraine, with high probability, might open up a new market for these gangs to buy weapons. I personally doubt that mainstream media will report on this until maybe 5 to 15 years later, after the war in Ukraine is over. In the Western world, especially in Sweden, we rarely talk about the blowback from these imperialist interventions. Imagine if a drug dealer acquires a Stinger missile and shoot down a civilian passenger plane to kill one of his rivals that are on board. In 2010, Stepan Bandera was awarded the Hero of Ukraine by then President Viktor Yushchenko. After much criticism from Poland, EU, and Israel, as well as many Ukrainians, he had to revise this decision and took it back. However, after the 2014 Maidan coup, there has been a resurgence of glorification of Stepan Bandera and other Nazi collaborators. It's foremost the people of Western Ukraine, Galicia, who view Stepan Bandera as a hero, while people in Eastern Ukraine see him as a Nazi collaborator and a traitor. The Western Ukrainian heroic narrative of figures such as Stepan Bandera, Roman Shukhevich, and Simon Petilura is what's being promoted in the rest of the country. Stepan Bandera was the leader of the OUNB and its paramilitary wing UPA, Ukrainian Insurgency Army. And they were responsible for the massacre of 100,000 Poles and 10,000 Jews. Shukhevich is one of the main perpetrators of the massacre of Poles in Volyn. He was also one of the leaders of the OUNB and later promoted to captain by Nazi Germany. In the eyes of many Ukrainians, Petilura is celebrated for declaring independence from the Russian Empire in 1917. But under his leadership and government, pogroms were taking place against Jews. Petilura didn't order the pogroms, however, the UPR were reluctant to stop them. These are the people that are being hailed as heroes in modern-day Ukraine. They got statues raised up and streets named after them. There are monuments set up for Ukrainian Nazi collaborators in the United States as well. Bandera's birthday is being celebrated, which caused a spat between Ukraine's ally Poland and the Kiev regime. Every year, 1st of January, Ukrainian nationalists march with torches to celebrate the birthday of Stepan Bandera. The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, tweeted a photo of him posing next to a portrait of Stepan Bandera with a thumbs up. There is a silent acceptance of this in the collective West, and as of late, they even tried to whitewash the 14th Galician SS Division after the Canadian Parliament invited Yaroslav Hunka, a Ukrainian World War II SS veteran, by claiming that the Ukrainians who fought the Soviets did so for altruistic reasons, such as freedom and independence. Not all Ukrainians who fought the Soviets were Nazis, is the type of message they're trying to portray. The Ukrainian Secret Service or Intelligence Service have a hit list of people they want to kill. Many of them are American citizens, such as Jackson Hinkle, Scott Ritter. There was even a 13-year-old girl on that list. Daria Dugina was on that list. I think it's called the Mirotovorts list. I apologize for my pronunciation here. And another very spectacular and brutal moment of repression in Ukraine was the massacre of 46 people in a unionist hall in Odessa in 2014, I believe it was, by all nationalists who opposed basically people who didn't agree with the regime change coup d'etat that took place in Kiev. These are some examples of how Ukraine is a repressive state, and it's not a independent country. And this Mirotovorts list is funded by the State Department, by the way. You guys can go and check out my Substack if you want to read about different geopolitical events and situations. So stay tuned for that, and subscribe and hit the like button if you like my content. See you in the next one.